Ever tried to work on like a document with a bunch of people? Everyone's making changes, and then suddenly you've got like 50 versions floating around with names like final, final, really final dot doc.
Oh, yeah, I know exactly what you mean. It's like trying to put together a puzzle, but the pieces keep changing shape. That's collaborative work before version control.
Yeah. And that's why version control is such a game changer. It's like this system for keeping track of every little change in your project, deletions, tweaks, whether it's code or research paper or even like a design file.
You got it. With version control, you can rewind to any point in a project's history. You can see who made what change and when and why. And this is important. It lets you merge different versions together without creating a total Frankenstein's monster of a file.
It's like having a time machine for your work
Yeah.
and a safety net too.
Hmm?
But how did all this begin? I mean, were people always this organized?
Not at all. Early version control systems were very basic. Imagine just numbering files in a sequence, like version 1.1, 1.2, and so on. That works okay for solo projects, but add a few collaborators, and it's chaos.
Yeah, I can see that. Um, did those early systems have any way to handle multiple people working on the same project at the same time?
Some did, but it wasn't pretty. Tools like SCCS and RCS introduced branches and subversions. These let developers work on separate lines of development. But even with those things got complicated fast, especially with larger projects.
So what was the next big breakthrough? How do we go from simple numbering to the more sophisticated systems that we have today?
Well, it was a shift from numbers to names. So instead of version 2.5.1, you could have a version named something like graphics%mouse,
Wow.
which instantly tells you it's related to the user interface.
So the name itself gives you information about what's changed in that version.
Precisely. And it made merging different versions a lot more manageable. You could use something like a plus operator to combine features. For example, you could have a version called Japanese plus graphics plus infinite plus X to indicate a Japanese Lisp system with specific features.
Okay. But merging still sounds risky. What if the features that you're combining aren't compatible?
You're right to be cautious. Version control systems can help manage the merging process, but it still needs careful human oversight to prevent conflicts and to make sure that everything works together.
This is fascinating. It seems like version control has really evolved a lot. What are some of the key milestones in this evolution? What are some of the big categories of version control systems?
Well, after those early local systems, we saw the rise of centralized version control systems,
Uh,
like CVS and Subversion. These made collaboration easier, but there was still a single point of failure, the central server. Then came the big revolution, distributed version control systems, like Git.
Git. I hear that name everywhere. What's so special about it?
With Git, every developer has a complete copy of the entire project history. It makes it really robust and flexible.
That sounds amazing. It probably makes collaboration smoother too, right?
Exactly. And it opened up new possibilities for open source development. People from all over the world can contribute to a project without needing constant access to a central server.
So Git is the state-of-the-art then in version control.
Pretty much. Platforms like GitHub and GitLab have built on top of Git to provide like a social coding environment. You can share code there, track issues, and collaborate with others. It's become the standard for software development, and it's increasingly being used for other types of projects as well.
That makes sense, given how important collaboration is these days. But before we go too deep into Git, let's take a step back and make sure we're all on the same page. How is version control different from simply backing up your files?
That's a great question. Backups are essential for protecting your data from loss. They're more like snapshots in time. Version control lets you track individual changes and understand the evolution of your work.
So I could restore my project to a specific point with a backup, but I can't really rewind and see how it got there.
Exactly. Backups are good for disaster recovery. But version control gives you much more fine-grained control. You can understand the history of your project and make better decisions about how to manage changes.
And how does version control relate to the software lifecycle? Is it just for the initial coding phase, or does it play a role throughout the process?
Version control is essential throughout the entire software lifecycle, from initial design and coding all the way through testing, deployment, and maintenance.
So it's not a one-time thing. It's an integral part of how software is developed and maintained over time.
Precisely. Version control makes sure that everyone on the project has access to the latest code, can track changes, and can easily revert to previous versions if needed.
I'm starting to see the bigger picture. But with all this talk about software, I'm wondering, can version control be used for other things besides code?
Absolutely. Any information that exists in a text-based format can benefit from version control. Think research papers, legal documents, scripts, even design files.
So a novelist could use version control to track changes to their manuscript.
Absolutely. Imagine never having to worry about losing an earlier draft or wondering what changes you made between versions. Version control takes care of all of that for you, so you can focus on your creative process.
Wow, this is blowing my mind. I never realized how versatile version control could be. Are there specific types of version control that are better for certain types of projects?
Yes, there are. But before we get into the different types, let's look at some real-world examples of how version control is used in different scenarios. It'll help make the concepts a little more clear.
That sounds great. Let's dive into those examples.
Okay, ready to see version control in action? Let's start with something relatable. Imagine you're writing a research paper with a colleague.
Okay, so picture this. We're both making edits and sending drafts back and forth, ending up with files named like paper fiston, finally your Reddit's v2.x. It's a total mess.
Exactly. Now imagine using a version control system like Git. No more emailing files around. You both work on the same repository, each with your own copy. Your colleague makes suggestions on their own branch, a separate region of the paper.
Okay, so they can tweak things without messing with my original draft.
Right. You review their suggestions, and if you like them, you merge their branch into your main version. Simple, clean, and no more confusing file names.
Wow, that's a lot more organized. But let's make it more complex. How does this work with a bigger project like developing a website?
Okay. Imagine a team of designers, coders, and content writers all working on a website. Without version control, keeping track of who changed what and when would be impossible.
Yeah, one little change could cause a bunch of problems if everyone isn't on the same page.
Exactly. Version control to the rescue. Each team member works on their own branch, makes changes, tests them out, and when they're ready, merges their work into the main branch.
So it's like a central hub where everyone can contribute without stepping on each other's toes.
Precisely. And this doesn't only manage the development process, but it creates a detailed history of every change.
So if something breaks, we can go back and see what caused the problem?
Yeah, like a detective. You can retrace all the steps. This historical record is valuable for fixing bugs, understanding the code's evolution, and ensuring transparency, especially in open source projects.
Wow, that's incredible. You mentioned earlier that figuring out developer effort can be a challenge with version control. How do people address this in real-world projects?
Well, it's a hot research topic. One approach is to analyze patterns of commits to try to identify different types of developers.
Different types, what do you mean?
Not all contributions are equal. Some developers are powerhouses making frequent substantial changes. Others might just pop in every now and then with small
Oh,
fixes.
so it's like creating a profile for each developer based on their activity.
Exactly. By looking at commit frequency size and timing, you can tell the difference between core developers and occasional contributors. This gives valuable insights to project managers and researchers who are studying open source dynamics.
This is fascinating. It's like version control data tells a story about the project and the people involved. We've talked a lot about how version control is used, but what are the different categories of these systems?
Great question. We've touched on local version control systems, which are good for solo projects but limited for collaboration. Then there are centralized systems like CVS and Subversion, good for teams, but they rely on that single server. Finally, we have distributed systems like Git.
Git, the one everyone's talking about. What makes these distributed systems so special?
With distributed systems, every developer has a full copy of the project history, so there's no single point of failure. They're flexible, and collaboration is seamless.
That sounds really robust. It must have been a revolution for software development.
It really was. Git, in particular, has become the industry standard. Platforms like GitHub and GitLab are built on top of it. They've created thriving communities where developers can share code track issues and collaborate globally.
It's amazing how something that started so simply by just numbering files has evolved into this powerful tool for collaboration and innovation. But even with all of its advantages, are there limitations to version control? What challenges do developers face when using these systems?
Well, version control is powerful, but it's not perfect. There are challenges. For example, managing large binary files can be difficult. They can bloat the repository and slow things down.
Oh, okay. So what do developers do about that?
There are strategies like Git large file storage or Git LFS. This stores large files externally but keeps references to them in the repository. Another challenge is dealing with sensitive information, passwords or API keys. You wouldn't want those ending up in the version history.
Right. That could be a security nightmare.
Exactly. So careful configuration is needed to make sure that sensitive data isn't tracked. And then there's the human element, ensuring that teams are communicating effectively and using consistent strategies and writing clear messages with their commits.
So even with the best technology, it comes down to people using it effectively.
Absolutely. The technology is great, but it's the people and the processes that make version control really powerful.
This has been so insightful. We've gone from these early numbering systems to this complex world of distributed version control. We've looked at how it's used in the real world, and we even touched on some of the challenges. What are your final thoughts on where this is all heading?
I'm glad you're enjoying this. Let's wrap up with some key takeaways and some thoughts about the future of version control.
Okay, so we've explored like the whole evolution of version control, from simple numbering systems to Git and GitHub. And we've seen how it's used in software research and writing and even design. But before we finish up, I'm curious, what does all this mean for like the average person? Why should someone who isn't a programmer or a techie care about version control at all?
That's a great question. If we zoom out and look at the big picture, version control is about a lot more than managing files and code. It's a philosophy, a way of thinking about managing information and change and making collaboration easier.
So it's not just the technology itself, but the ideas behind it that are important.
Exactly. And these ideas can be applied to tons of fields. Anything where information is always evolving, scientific research, legal documents, creative writing. Being able to track changes and experiment and revert to earlier versions is really valuable in any kind of collaborative environment.
So even if I never learned to code, understanding version control can still help me.
Definitely. It encourages a more structured approach to information, and that can help anyone, no matter what your job is. Imagine being able to easily track a project and see who contributed what, and revert back to earlier versions if you need to. It's like having a superpower.
That's a great way to put it. But let's be real. Most people aren't going to become experts in version control right away. What's one simple takeaway for an average person who's maybe hearing about this for the first time?
The main takeaway is that version control makes your work more resilient, more collaborative, and more transparent. It's like a safety net. It lets you experiment and try new things and make mistakes without the fear of losing all your progress or breaking something forever. Even if you don't use the tools directly, understanding the principles can help you think more strategically about information and collaborating with other people.
That's a good point. It's not just about mastering a tool. It's about changing your mindset to be open to changes and collaboration.
Exactly. And as information becomes even more dynamic and connected, this mindset is going to be even more important.
Well, this has been a really eye-opening conversation. We started from those basic numbering systems and went all the way to Git and GitHub and explored how version control is used in so many different ways.
It's been a pleasure talking with you about this. Hopefully, our listeners now understand a bit more about version control, this thing that is usually invisible, but is so important to how our digital world works.
Absolutely. And maybe some of our listeners will be inspired to learn even more about version control. There's so much to discover.
I think you're right. I'm excited to see what new innovations and collaborations come about as more and more people discover the power of version control.
That's a great thought to leave our listeners with. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into version control. Until next time.